Well, with me now is the former Prime Minister of Australia and now President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, Kevin Rudd. Welcome. Thank you very much for being with us here on BBC World News. So we heard this suggestion that China would offer to slash the trade deficit by $200 billion. They're saying that's not the case. What do you make of what's been going on in the past few days with this trade talks as they draw to a close?
Well, Liu He, the Senior Vice Premier responsible, has Xi Jinping's personal trust to conduct these negotiations. The American ask now, going back over several months now, is for in fact $200 billion. In fact, the internal ask has been $100 billion this year, $100 billion next year. What the Chinese have said is, hey, we just can't turn the switch that rapidly. Besides, there's stuff we actually need to buy in that level of volume. So I suspect all efforts now are on reaching a deal. I'm very sceptical as to whether it will pass the magical $200 billion mark set by the administration. Then, of course, there's the big technology complication which sits in the background of all of this.
Yeah, and this is why America decided to pull out of this trade agreement in the first place, or certainly impose these trade tariffs, because they say China insists on all the intellectual rights to whatever kind of goes over there. Yeah, how do they resolve that?
Well, I think in many respects the trade dispute over goods is kind of the secondary story here, even though it's being treated as the primary story. The real story is this emerging Cold War and high technology trade and investment relationship between the two countries. The American decision only a few weeks ago to effectively prevent American exporters from selling to the Chinese firm ZTE, which has enormous implications for that firm's ability to survive. Their reasons for the ban were okay. ZTE was breaking sanctions and selling stuff on to the Iranians. But this is a big company by Chinese standards, and Xi Jinping himself has intervened, it seems, in direct communications with Trump to throw it into the overall trade negotiations. We'll give you a large number on the trade in goods, take the pressure off on the question of ZTE. Where it's going to land, anyone's guess. I'm not going to take out a crystal ball, because crystal balls can crack.
Yeah, often wrong. Stay with me, Kevin, if you would, because I just want to talk about another story that we're covering. This is the US and North Korea, obviously a big topic at the moment. President Trump has just appeared to contradict his own national security advisor, saying the so-called Libya model for denuclearization is not being pursued, and that was suggested by John Bolton. And that's angered North Korea, which has threatened to pull out of the June summit. However, let's just listen closely to President Trump, because he says that if there was no deal with Kim Jong-Un, then a later development in the Libya story, what he calls decimation, would happen. It seems complicated. Just listen to what he had to say and we'll discuss it.
The Libyan model isn't a model that we have at all when we're thinking of North Korea. If you look at that model with Gaddafi, that was a total decimation. We went in there to beat him. Now, that model would take place if we don't make a deal, most likely. But if we make a deal, I think Kim Jong-un is going to be very, very happy.
So, Kevin, just explain why this talk of a Libya deal, which is what happened under Colonel Gaddafi, is angering North Korea, and why there's some disagreement in the White House.
Well, you're right. There's a real conflict here between what John Bolton, National Security Advisor, has said and what the President has just said in this interview. Let's face it, President Trump is not a graduate from the Georgetown University School of International Diplomacy. That's not his stuff, and you can see that he's screwed up on the detail there quite badly. But the bottom line is this. The early deal with the Libyans was with Gaddafi back in the early 2000s was, we'll remove sanctions against Libya if you, Gaddafi, kill your nuclear program. That's what happened, but of course then come the events of the Arab Spring in 2011, we had the NATO direct involvement in the bombing of Libya to protect the people of Benghazi, and of course then Gaddafi fell. So what Trump obviously has in mind is the second part of what unfolded with Gaddafi. So his logic is this, as I read it, and I've tried to parse what he has said. You North Koreans, we don't want the bad outcome on Libya for you. We want the good earlier outcome for Libya for you, with the survivability of your regime guaranteed for the long term. That's what he means.
Good news as far as Kim Jong-un goes.
Then the difficult bit is that phrase you've just correctly highlighted, which is The bad Libya option, which is the guy gets taken out, that will happen, he says, quote, most likely, if you don't come to the table and agree with us on the denuclearization of North Korea. And for me, this brings into sharp focus what I think is the anxiety of most analysts at present, which is we're now in this phase of intense diplomacy. If it fails, what then is Plan B if the US administration judges diplomacy as having failed?
Just briefly, we've got developments all the time. North Korea in the past few hours rejected visa applications from South Korean journalists who are going to go to North Korea to see the closure of its nuclear test site. There's lots of these little things going on which detect a sort of a change in tone from North Korea. Do you actually think the summit will go ahead between Kim Jong-Un and President Trump?
This is a risk of the crystal ball again. On balance, I think, yes, it will, because we've seen a lot of this sort of behaviour from the North Koreans over time. That is, they ratchet up the pressure. And taking a strategic view of this, the Americans ratcheting up the pressure of itself is no bad thing. The key thing is whether they get round the table and they can agree on a common definition of denuclearization.